Hi, my name is Adnan Mahmutovic, and this is Love and Its Discontents podcast. It is a great pleasure to welcome today Dr. Paul Jaussen, an assistant professor at the Department of Humanities, Social Sciences, and Communication at Lawrence Technological University. His research focuses on poetry and poetics, literary theory and criticism, modernism, and contemporary literature. His works include Writing in Real Time, Emergent Poetics from Whitman to the Digital, and many essays and reviews. Dr. Jaussen is also co-editing a companion to American Poetry. He also co-directs the Humanity and Technology lecture series at LTU. Paul, I am so pleased to welcome you to Love and Its Discontents to discuss one of my favorite classics, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein.
It's a pleasure to be here, Adnan. Thank you very much for the invitation.
Certainly, a pleasure. So I thought we would start with the plot or the synopsis. If you could tell us, what is this book about?
Sure, absolutely. I mean, before I start, I would say it's one of those books that everyone knows, but not as many people have read. So often I think what the plot actually entails is a little bit surprising. So it begins actually with a series of letters from a sea captain on an adventure who's attempting to find a passage across the North Sea. His name is Captain Walton, and he's writing this series of letters to his sister, who's back home. And he's an adventurer. He wants to distinguish himself in science and in discovery, which is relevant for the guest he ends up taking onto his ship. About 3 or 4 letters in. So as they're traveling toward the North Sea, they see this giant figure kind of crossing the ice, which surprises them. They thought that there would be no one out there. And then shortly thereafter, they encounter a man who's on a boat that's in pretty bad shape. He's almost frozen to death. He's very, very hungry. They bring him on, and he's quite ill. But Walton is fascinated by him, and he starts telling him his story. The man's name is Victor Frankenstein, and he then proceeds to, over several chapters, narrate his upbringing, his interest in what's called natural philosophy, which today we would call natural sciences, and his eventual discovery of what he calls the substance of life, or the secret of life, which was a big topic at that time in scientific discourse. As a result of this discovery, he decides to create a being, a kind of oversized human. He says that he creates him larger than normal proportions because it's easier for him to do the actual work instead of looking at all the sort of like fine organs that make up a human being. So he creates this being, and as soon as he brings it to life, he's absolutely terrified and horrified by it. He leaves his laboratory, which is actually his apartment, and eventually comes back with a friend named Henry Clerval, and the creature is gone. And in discovering that the creature has disappeared, Victor kind of collapses. The months of working on this project have left him in this kind of heightened and enfeebled state. So he collapses. He's ill for quite some time. Eventually he recovers. And then about 18 months later, almost 2 years later, he gets this terrible news that his young brother has been murdered. He returns home to see his family, and discovers not only that his young brother has been murdered, but a young servant who has been like a member of the family, Justine, has been accused of the murder because she had a locket that was on young William's body at the time of the murder, was found on her person. So in the process of Justine's trial, the creature, Victor, is out one night and he sees this creature at a distance, and he immediately says, "Oh, he must be the murderer." So despite everyone's efforts to save Justine's life, because they know that she couldn't have done this, even though the evidence points against her, she is tried and eventually executed for it. Victor and his cousin, fiance Elizabeth, we'll talk a little bit about their relationship later. They go to travel a bit to kind of recover from all this tragedy. And they're up in the Alps, and Victor's out alone. And all of a sudden, he sees this creature coming toward him, the creature he's created. He recognized him because of his great size. He's extremely nimble. He can walk over the ice much faster than any other human being would. And the creature tells him his story. There's some conflict when the creature first confronts Victor. Victor says, accuses him of murder, and the creature very eloquently, which I think is one of the first things that people who know the film adaptations don't realize, is that this creature is incredibly eloquent. Is kind of a master of language in a lot of ways. So the creature says, "Let me at least tell you my story. You owe me this, and then after you hear my story, then we can decide what happens next." So then for several chapters, the creature takes over the story, and he basically tells what has happened from his perspective. A big part of that is his very, very early development. He sort of is wandering out in the world without friends, without anyone to nurture him. Slowly, he discovers how to sort out his own sensations and his perceptions. But he quickly realizes that he has this horrific appearance. In fact, it's interesting. One detail from the book that intrigues me is that early on, he tries to mimic birds because he hears the birds singing, and even his own imitations scare him. His own sound scares him. So there's this sense in which he's aware of his own sort of ugliness, and he registers it too. So as a result of his appearance, other humans he encounters don't really like him. He figures this out pretty quickly and decides to take shelter in this tiny little, almost like a shed that he calls a hovel, which is attached to a cottage. And through chinks in the wall, he can see this family that's living in the cottage. And eventually we learn that their last name is the DeLacy family. Their story is quite complicated. I think for the sake of plot summary, I won't get into it right now because I don't want to just keep talking. But they've been exiled from Paris. The short version is they've been exiled from Paris after Felix, the adult son in the family, has helped free this Turkish merchant who was unjustly imprisoned, and his imprisonment was clearly seen to be due to bigotry against the Turkish merchant. So his family is exiled. The father of the family is blind, which is an important detail because the creature eventually learns language. He learns how to read, and he decides that his best shot at finding society, finding companionship, finding affection, love, is to avail himself to this family who he has come to really emotionally bond with, even though they, of course, don't know that he exists. So he makes his move. He goes to speak to old man DeLacy while the rest of the family is out because he knows that he's blind and he won't be repulsed by his appearance. And DeLacy says, "I will sort of advocate for you, to the people that you want to attach yourself to." Because he tells him a sort of a version of the story, the kind of "I have a friend," so to speak, type of story. And but while they're having this conversation, the rest of the family appears, and they're immediately terrified. Felix attacks the creature, casts him out of the house, and the creature retreats back to his hovel. And there's a really interesting moment too. He rages. He's very, very angry, and he kind of stalks off through the night. But then, as morning comes, he says, I decided that I was too hasty. He says, I decided to make another appeal to them, and I realized that there still was a chance here. And so he returns with the intention of trying again, and overhears Felix saying, "We can't live here anymore. We have to leave. This experience was too terrifying. My father is, in dire straits because of this." And that's when he really has his moment of turning against humanity in many respects. He burns down the cottage and had discovered in the clothes that he took from Victor's lab, Victor's lab notes, his lab journal. So he knows the story of his origin at this point. And so he decides Victor Frankenstein is the only person in the world who owes me anything and for whom I can make any appeal. So he goes to try to hunt down Victor. And in doing so, he, as he's kind of approaching Geneva, where Victor's from, he stumbles upon what happens to be William Frankenstein, Victor's younger brother, in the forest, and believes that, sort of pivots his plan and says, if I take this child who doesn't have bigotry or bias against my appearance, I could slowly cultivate them to be a companion for myself. So he at first attempts to kidnap William, and then William says, my father is a magistrate, Monsieur Frankenstein. He's going to put you in jail. And as soon as he hears the name Frankenstein, the creature says, "Oh, you're related to my enemy," and that's when he decides to kill William. He then tells Victor that he took the locket from William's body and found Justine asleep in a barn after she'd been out all night looking for William, plants the locket on Justine's body, knowing that, in fact, human beings are vicious and violent and unjust, and that they will, accuse her of the crime. So everything that Victor suspected about the creature turns out, in fact, to be true. At the end of his story, though, the creature says, look, what is making me violent and vicious is the fact that I have no companion. I have no one to care for me, to sort of connect with in terms of in bonds of affection. Make me a female companion, and we will leave humanity behind. You'll never see us again. He says we'll go off to the wilds of South America. So there's a kind of colonial wilderness context in the story. And so Victor agrees. And then there's the plot moves pretty quickly after that in terms of Victor's traveling around a lot. He agrees to get engaged to Elizabeth, who grew up in his household, but was actually his first cousin. And then Victor and his friend Henry go to England and eventually to Scotland. And there Victor sort of removes himself from Henry's company for a couple months and starts making this female creature. The creature is sort of watching him from a distance, sort of shadowing him this whole time. And then in this kind of moment of clarity, Victor says, how do I know that this female creature is going to, even like the original creature, is going to, fulfill his desires? In fact, she might even be worse than he is and create more violence. So he destroys this female creature while the creature can see, so watching through the window. And the creature, of course, is extremely angry and says, I will be with you on your wedding night. So we're getting close to the end here. Victor, in what I think is intriguingly one of the most amazing moments of missing it in the whole book. Victor's a pretty savvy guy, but he thinks that the creature's threat is against him. So he arms himself and is prepared for kind of mortal combat with the creature on his wedding night. He assumes he's going to be killed because the creature's so big and so strong. He's waiting in the room for the creature to show up, and that's when he hears a scream from the back room. And, of course, the creature has killed Elizabeth, not Victor. Victor's father soon dies from the shock, and Victor decides that the only thing left for him to do is to chase down this creature. And the creature is sort of complicit in this pact. He leads the Victor on. There's moments when Victor is hungry and the creature brings him food, and eventually that takes them up to the North Sea, where we're back to where we started. Victor finishes his tale and says to Walton, look, I know I'm dying. I'm not going to be able to have my revenge on the creature. Will you do it for me? If you find him, will you kill him? Victor dies. And then the final scene of the book is actually the creature in Walton's cabin on the ship. He appears and he's sort of mourning Victor, and sort of it's this final confession where he says, I didn't take pleasure in doing what I did. My heart was knit for affection. He says something along those lines. And, rejection and solitude made me this way. And then he claims that he's going to go and burn himself in the ocean, and that the story will be over because they will both be dead. And that's the ending of the story. So no Igor, no mobbing villagers, no like electrodes coming out of the neck, like so many of the things that are just like so visually associated. The creature's not named Frankenstein, right? The creature is just referred to as the creature or the monster or the daemon. So yeah, I didn't mean to be that detailed, but I feel like there's all these small points that it's in so many ways like a rich story, even on the level of plot, that I thought it was worth going into some of those.
Absolutely, and thank you so much for that detailed synopsis, because there's quite a lot of things there to look at. And I'm thinking, so as you were telling us about the story, what it is about, there's a lot of horrible stuff going on, and this is also what this kind of prejudice against the book, or these kinds of preconceived notions about what it is about, that it's a horror story, it's a gothic, that there is a lot of murder, and there is a monster, there is a mad scientist, all those typical tropes that we are kind of familiar with. And when I ask my own students, for instance, to look at it through the lens of love, I say, well, this is a love story. So it's not a horror story, or it is actually, but what if we approach it as a love story? And then you look at it and you see that the word love is present on almost every page, which is really remarkable. So it's not just that it's dramatized in different scenes through different relationships, but also the word itself is repeated so often throughout the entire story. And as you said, in the end, the creature has this very kind of intellectual self-reflection. He is able to kind of diagnose his rage, and say, this is basically all I've done. The reason I am a monster is because I did not receive the love that I was supposed to receive. The love that was owed me as any other creature is owed love. So what do you think? Is this a love story? In which way is it a love story? And yeah,
it's such a great comment and an observation. I mean, it's a framework that I confess I hadn't personally applied to the book, but as soon as you proposed this conversation, I immediately knew that yes, love is everywhere. And I think not only the word love explicitly, but also a lot of its synonyms or words that we would associate with it, right? Like passion, affection, friendship. When I teach this story, one of the very first things I ask my students to focus on is the framing narrative, because I skipped over, as detailed as that summary was, I skipped over, there's quite a bit of Victor's own family background in this story, and a lot of that hinges on love for a friend, love for a cousin, the love that Walton has for his sister, whom we discover is an orphan, that he and his sister is an orphan, are orphans. And so I used to call it like weird family. I realize that's not exactly like, I feel like that's a little too pejorative. So lately I've been interested in the way that like early on there's so much emphasis on these kind of like unconventional kind of chosen families throughout the early part of the book, which I think speaks to how much this is a book about those kind of bonds, those love bonds, right? In terms of, and then of course there's the question of passion, right? Like what passions drive Victor or drive the creature? And that's where I think that's what most people think of when they hear the word love stories, right? Like some kind of like compelling passion. And that's also throughout the book in so many ways. That's kind of where I would initially go with that.
Yes.
What about you? I mean, where?
Absolutely. And I'm thinking, I mean, one of the questions I asked myself to begin with, first of all, I would like us to kind of list different kinds of love that there are in the book, and ask ourselves, well, why is Victor even trying to recreate a human being? Why is he trying to create life? Where does that desire come from? And what is he trying to achieve? What is the kind of the driving force in that endeavor?
So I think there's both a simple answer and a complex answer. So I think, and I'll kind of start with the complex one and then get to the simpler one. He says early on, we're told that Victor is raised in a very caring and also like intellectually rich household, right? He's the son of the elite of Geneva. His father had distinguished himself in politics, was married later in life, and sort of created this familial. And then after he had children, sort of dedicated himself to their education. And in Victor's case, he stumbles upon. He says that natural philosophy had always been his passion. So there's a sort of has this temperamental draw toward science, but he stumbles upon a book of Cornelius Agrippa when he's very young. And Cornelius Agrippa was an ancient alchemist. And by that point, even though alchemy still, I learned recently, alchemy still persisted well into the 19th century. We often think of it as just sort of being this medieval or Renaissance practice. But by that point, Cornelius Agrippa was very much outdated. And there's this scene where Victor's father says, "Oh, Victor, this is just trash. Don't read this." And Victor says, "I wish my father had taken the time to explain to me, why this is a problem, but he didn't." And so, of course, when you're a kid and your dad says, "Don't do something," you're probably going to go do it. So that's why he keeps reading it. But I bring it up because I would make the case that Victor falls for Cornelius Agrippa, right? He falls because I think like loving a book is also a part of this novel. I mean, like the way that the creature will eventually learn to love Paradise Lost. So there's this kind of like it's almost like he's seduced by these alchemists and the kind of promises for the Sorcerer's Stone or the Elixir of Life, and that kind of like fundamentally shapes his imagination. And I think part of what Shelley's saying is that if it weren't for that, the later Victor, who eventually becomes a kind of master of modern science, might not have really done what he'd done, right? Like he might not have gone as aggressively or as far as he'd gone. So I think like love for an author in one sense is one reason why Victor does what he does. But the other one is, he says this very explicitly, that after he had discovered the meaning, the origin of life, even though he knew that he couldn't bring back the dead yet, eventually he hoped that he'd be able to do that. And we know that just before Victor goes off to college, that his mother had died of scarlet fever, a infection she contracts because she loves Elizabeth almost too much and goes into her sickbed before the threat of while she was still contagious. So even though Elizabeth is young and healthy and recovers from the scarlet fever, she passes it on to Caroline, Victor's mother and Elizabeth's stepmother, and Caroline dies from it. So it's in many respects the oldest kind of like your podcast title cites Freud, right? Love and its discontents comes from civilization and its discontents. At least that's what I hear. And there's a kind of like, it's like the oldest Freudian story, right? Your mother dies and you want to bring her back, right? So there's a sort of like, that's I don't know, that's the way I think is really motivating Victor in a lot of ways.
I agree, absolutely. I mean, that is, you pointed out these two different motivations. One is the love of science and being seduced by these alchemists, but the other is the very raw, primordial kind of love for the mother and trying to bring her back. That this idea for me is like between love and death. That love is kind of valuable because it's not immortal. So there is this attempt to kind of preserve love by beating death. I really love that bit. I think that kind of motivation is really amazing because that's what he pursues. And there is this family love, perhaps the most basic kind of love that is between a mother and a child, or the parents and children. And I wanted to ask you, there is, because you mentioned science and you mentioned these, in a sense, he is trying to give the gift of life to humanity. And that is kind of connected to the myth of Prometheus, which is there in the title. So Frankenstein or the modern Prometheus. So I wonder if you can maybe comment a little bit on that. What did Prometheus do? Why did he do it? And how is Victor connected to that myth?
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought that up because it's also another part of the book that is passed over or people don't think about, right? Even though my impression is I can't keep up on all of the comic book superhero movies, but I understand there's like a whole Prometheus series. So I think my students now are a little more attuned to Prometheus than maybe 20 years ago. So, Prometheus, the short version is that Prometheus is one of these guys. He was a Titan. He's kind of in the tradition of some trickster figures in the sense that he steals things, but he's also a craftsman. He's associated with the arts. And I always stress that there's kind of two versions of the myth that I think are really relevant here. The one is that in one version, Prometheus actually creates humanity. He forges human beings. So that has obvious parallels with what Victor does. But in the other one, the one that's better, sort of the version that's probably better known, Victor steals fire from the gods and brings it to humans. Prometheus steals fire from the gods and brings them to humans. And Victor uses this language explicitly when he says that, going back to your life and death, he says, life and death appear to me as ideal bounds. In that sense, like they're just ideas. And that I would sort of, I would send a new light out into humanity, right? So this idea that we no longer have to live with death, right? That would be sort of the human, that would be kind of like Victor as the Promethean figure who brings fire to the humans, right? Metaphorically and literally. But there's also the Victor who brings to life a new species, a new kind of being, right? And so there's this kind of dualism, it seems to me, in the Promethean figure. Of course, Prometheus is famously punished. As a Titan, he can't die, so Zeus chains him to a rock, and every day this vulture eagle comes and eats out his liver, and then every night it grows back, and then the next day the bird who's always like looking for an easy meal says, "Oh, I can come back and eat his liver again," and so he's sort of like bound this perpetual pain, right? So, what I like to tell my students is Prometheus. When I sort of like unpack the myth with them just a little bit, I always say, "So is Prometheus a hero or a villain?" Right? And it really depends on whose version of the story you're looking at, right? Like for humans, he would be this somewhat sacrificial hero. For Zeus, he's, violating the proper hierarchy, and so is a villain who must be punished. So I think that is a really important framework for thinking through our interpretation of the book, because I resist the interpretation that, the easy, obvious interpretation is this is science gone bad, and this is what happens when you mess with the natural order. the flip interpretation, the kind of more like, slightly nuanced interpretation is, well, actually, Victor is neglectful of his creation. He's irresponsible. Like, this is all about his failures, his moral failures. And I just don't think that Prometheus gives us that easy of a way out, right? I think there's a lot more ambiguity there. And the same way I think love is pretty ambiguous, right? And I think that there's a lot of characters in the book, including Victor, including the creature, who sort of flip their emotional position, right? And I think that as readers, we're caught in that kind of, we're sort of torn in both directions in our understanding of what's happening with these characters in the story. So yeah, that's the way I approached the Prometheus part. But interestingly enough, I would also add, and maybe we can get into this, along with Prometheus, Paradise Lost, which I've already mentioned, is kind of like the text that haunts the whole book. And what's intriguing is the way those two kind of mythologies bleed into each other. So where Victor simultaneously, and the creature, sort of identify themselves with both Prometheus and with Satan, and that kind of like idea of a figure that's punished for usurpation or for stepping outside of the bounds, I think is really interesting to me.
Absolutely. And in both cases, you ask yourself, okay, why did they do this? So for Prometheus, you could say, okay, well, if he's the creator of humankind, then he owes the humankind to care for them. Even if he is not, even if he only stole the fire from the gods and gave it to the humans, that's an ultimate act of love for which he is punished. So in a sense, he suffers eternally for giving the greatest gift of life, in a sense, the gift that defines humanity, which is technology. So fire is both love and technology, which is really interesting here. This one seems to be natural and the other artificial. But I think Shelley's playing with this doubleness, as you say, this what's natural, what's man-made, and where is the danger and the moral responsibility? Because Victor doesn't care for the creature. Prometheus cared for human beings, for instance. Of course, the Paradise Lost is different, but that is where the creature learns this tale of the creation of Adam. So we see later on when the creature is presenting his case, he says, I am your Adam. I am your creation. So just the way God cared for Adam or was supposed to care for Adam, so you should care for me, or you should have cared for me. So there is almost like this natural, as you said earlier, bond, an implied bond, something that seems to be a default relationship between the creator and the created. And he calls that, he uses that logic. It's something he learned from books, as you said. You said earlier, he's actually really well read.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, sometimes when I speak to people, I say, I mean, I'm a teacher, I have a PhD, and so do you. But sometimes the creature seems more educated, and he's read more than I have, which is really weird because we have this sense of a monster who is just a brute, but he's really actually really quite well read and quite intelligent.
Yeah, it's his eloquence far surpasses mine when it comes to, like, my lectures aren't nearly that good. I mean, we know for sure he's read 3 books very closely, but then there's also, so we haven't, in my synopsis, just for the sake of time, I left out the story of Safi, who is the daughter of the Turkish merchant, who comes to the DeLacy family while the creature's there. She and Felix are in love with one another. In fact, she was one of them. The implications that Felix, was drawn to help the Turkish merchant because he recognized the injustice that was being the injustice in the situation. But then when he meets daughter, he has a sort of positive incentive, which I think actually, as we're talking, is a fantastic sort of moment where you have the question of justice, which is the obligations that you're talking about, like the creator's obligation to the creature, and passion kind of intersecting, right, in that kind of relationship. So yeah, Felix is educating Safi, who doesn't speak French, which is how the creature is able to like get this education. I mean, it's a beautiful kind of Deus Ex Machina type of device, from a literary perspective that she sets it up. But it's clear throughout that the creature's intelligence far exceeds humans because just how quickly he can sort of accommodate himself to language and things like this. But I think your question had more to do with the other thing I was going to pick up on is when you were bringing up the parallel to Adam. One thing that interests me about love in the story, and I think love as a concept, is where these elements of human society and experience where we think love either sort of spontaneously emerges, like a parent for a child, or is a kind of obligation, like familial love, maybe love for nation, maybe love for God in a religious context, versus when love is this sort of free gift or something that kind of like happens to one unexpectedly, is sort of excessive, right? Doesn't have to be there. I think that you can kind of see both logics at work in the story, right? In a lot of ways. I mean, Victor always insists that his familial love and the friendships he has, especially with Clerval, are so rich that it never feels like an obligation, right? Like our family just wanted to be together. We just so enjoyed one another's company. But the creature says, yes, you owe this to me, right? Like you're my creator, you owe this to me. And he even says at one point, seems to imply that he owes, allegiance to Victor. Like I owe you something as well. So, I guess it's just, it's more of a comment than like a real full-blown interpretation, because I need to think about it a little bit more. But that play between the love that sort of arises out of necessity or some kind of necessity, and the love that is sort of spontaneous, right? Or that takes one over. And that can be a kind of, that's where I would argue Victor becomes the mad scientist. He's not mad with power. He's actually mad with this sort of like passionate drive to do this thing that's compelling him, right? He calls it like enthusiasm, right? Like being outside of oneself, being compelled by something, which I think is interesting too, because then we're talking about love for an area of study, a love for a practice, right? I don't know. That's another way we can think about love as it relates to these characters.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it seems to me that it goes in so many different directions. In a sense, all kinds of love can be listed as being present in the book. I was really quite struck, for instance, by the way love is used as also justification for things. I do something out of love, therefore it's good, for instance. Or that my motivation is love, or that's a good kind of motivation, and whatever I do is kind of justified by that love. So all the things that he does are kind of driven by that. But at the same time, there is also that sense, when he is when the creature kills different people. And you showed this in your plot summary that he is very cunning. He is conceiving of this revenge in a very intellectual way. Basically, he's going to hurt people Victor loves. So in a sense, if I cannot have your love, you will not have any love. So you will suffer. Hurting someone you love is a way of taking out revenge. So there is, for me, a very there is a sense of not just a kind of passion and rage, but very kind of pure reason. In order to conceive of this plot, the revenge plot, you have to be very intelligent. He's not just mad and just kills people. Rather, as you said with Elizabeth, he is not coming to face Victor, but rather he hurts her in order for him to show him, this. So I think it's an amazing kind of connection between love and hate here, and how that works. But there's something else I want to ask you, which is related to the things you said, especially the part of the story where the creature is giving his origin story, because he comes out as a kind of a tabula rasa. In a sense, he has no memory of a former self. Obviously, he must have had someone's brain, right? So in the movies, there is this comedy. I'm sure you know of it, Mel Brooks's comedy, in which they give the creature the abnormal instead of the genius brain, and so. But here, in a sense, he has no memory, so he has no self. He has to create it from bottom up, and as you said, he learns really quickly. So it's a very kind of natural intelligence. And I think what you asked, what you said earlier, where does love come from? Is it something he learned, or something that comes naturally from a very pure being, like this pure natural being, a new species? Because I'm not quite sure that the novel gives us a kind of a final decision on that. But still there is that question, because when he says, I'm your Adam, that means he learned it from a story. But at the same time, he seems to have an instinctive sense or need or desire for love, and recognizes what true love is. So I'm a little bit curious about this kind of nature, culture, and what is the book trying to do with this?
Yeah. So, one of the things that I point out to my students in those very early passages in Tabula Rasa, I'm not an 18th century scholar, so one could get into people who study intellectual history more could talk about different nuances here. But I've always agreed with you. It's sort of this kind of Lockean moment where you're born into the world. There's you're kind of a blank slate of complex sensations, right? He even says, like, I couldn't distinguish one sensation from another. I do think it's still a powerful passage of like what consciousness's emergence might be like, this thing that none of us can remember, right? But like being born into the world and having all these sensations and then having to kind of sort them out perceptually. But one thing that's early in that, when he's one of the results of the way she sets up the plot is that he doesn't really experience much at all that he can recognize as an experience until he's in a non-human space. He's out in the forest. And so it's very Edenic in that sense, right? Like this sort of origin story in a non-human world. But very early, he does talk about appreciating beauty, right? So we might think about the relationship between like love and beauty here, the idea of like being drawn to something. So there's a very kind of like natural in the sense of like, he didn't have to learn that. He just sort of like is drawn to the beauty of like the bird song or of the moon. And he starts using the language of pleasure and pain to talk about these things. There's also that moment where he's like heating himself up by a fire that he finds the shepherd had left, and then he like sticks his hand in the fire and it hurts. And so he's realizing these two things are related. The pleasure and pain could be connected. But when he finally is in the hovel and observing the DeLacy family, there's this scene. Actually, if you give me a second, I think I can find it really quickly in my copy. There's this passage where he's just watching the family, and he sees Agatha, who he will eventually learns her name is Agatha, and weeping. And he sees her father, Mr. Lacey, come and comfort her. And there's this amazing passage to me that I think really gets to that tipping point of where does love come from, and how do we feel it? Okay, so I'll just read this one passage. Mr. DeLacy is playing guitar, so there's also music here, which the creature links back to the bird song. He said, he played a sweet and mournful air, which I perceived drew tears from the eyes of his amiable companion, of which the old man took no notice, until she sobbed audibly. He then pronounced a few sounds, and the fair creature, leaving her work, knelt at his feet. He raised her, and smiled with such kindness and affection that I felt sensations of a peculiar and overpowering nature. They were a mixture of pain and pleasure, such as I had never before experienced, either from hunger or cold, warmth or food, and I withdraw from the window, unable to bear these emotions. I find this a really remarkable passage because what she's essentially doing is, it's like she's recreating the scene of like emotional intelligence, right? Where he's experiencing this combination of pain and pleasure that is really relational and interpersonal pain and pleasure, right? Because I always say to students, the pain is, in one sense, he's identifying with the young girl's weeping, so he recognizes her pain. But then he sees the comfort that the father is providing, and that comfort is also a kind of pleasure, right? It's something that he identifies with. And he doesn't even understand. It overwhelms him, right? He's like, I had to pull myself away from the scene. I couldn't. This was beyond what I had ever had before. But he's starting to grasp it, right? And so it's this kind of triangulation, right, of the fact that in relationships with other human beings, we can have pleasure and pain simultaneously, right? Like the act of being comforted when you're hurt is a very distinctive, it's very different than never having been hurt or just being hurt, right? So it's this, and that's only possible because of other people, because of the existence of other people. So I would, it's not really an answer to your question, because it's clear that the creature's kind of what we call now his emotional intelligence needs examples, but quickly acclimates those examples, right? I love pets, but I always say my pets don't do this quite the same way, my family does this, or like even a stranger does this, right? So there's this capacity for that interpersonal attunement, which becomes a weapon when he starts killing off Victor's loved ones, right? Indeed.
You're quite right. So he learns so much from that scene.
Exactly.
It's almost like doing a close analysis, a close reading of a real life scene, and just abstracting quite a lot of knowledge from it, as you say. It reminds me a little bit, almost like something Platonic, almost like finding form in the examples, or extracting or abstracting forms, or the ideals or ideas of love, compassion, care, pain, pleasure, all those abstract notions from these concrete situations, which he was able to use later on. So that's quite fascinating, as you say. So at the same time, there is this learning from observing, but also there is a recognition of something that's already in him. So in that sense, maybe it's a little bit Platonic, that this recognition of the form that you already know of.
That you have inside of you.
That you have inside of you.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting too. I mean, Shelley doesn't do a lot with the idea of like embodied inheritance, right? Like the Brooksian, like what brain does the creature have? A later writer, Shelley Jackson, has this digital retelling of Frankenstein called Patchwork Girl. And it's kind of like a feminist reimagining of the text through digital media. And she explicitly sort of imagines this sort of embodied knowledge that the creature might have inherited through the donors, right? Like the kind of the hands of a weaver at one point, and like his hands can do certain things. So that's a fascinating. We could update. I don't know. This now I'm well beyond my area of expertise, but you can update kind of embodied, think about love and embodied knowledge, and like the way desire comes out of these sort of early physical, tangible experiences, right?
Yes.
That would take us in a different direction.
But it is exciting that she uses love as the center of this discovery of knowledge, of being, of selfhood. So love becomes kind of central, like a catalyst for all the other things to converge. How he discovers, for instance, who he is. What kind of a being is he, for instance? So the question of selfhood and loving himself, how does he learn that he's supposed to love himself, for instance? Is he supposed to love himself? Or is he only supposed to be loved by others? So what does it even mean for him to be, as you said earlier, a different species, while just being a composite of different body parts from different people?
Yeah, and at the same time, it's interesting because you earlier said that you earlier mentioned his sort of rationality, and I think he can be incredibly rational. But I do think there's something like drive, right? Like in the sense that he feels almost imprisoned by these drives to essentially have recognition, right? To be recognized, not necessarily for a particular accomplishment, but just simply to have love, to have affection, to be cared for, right? It's really intriguing too, because I'm always I haven't thought through enough the role of sexuality in the book, because he asks specifically for a female companion, right? And it doesn't seem to be a primary motivator for him elsewhere, right? Like he says out, at one point, when he pivots and says, well, I can take this child and because he's so young, he hasn't developed prejudices against my appearance, and eventually I could teach him not to be prejudiced, and then I would have a friend, right? So it's in one sense it's Paradise Lost. He's going back to Adam and Eve. In the other sense, it's sort of like the coupling that he's seeing through other relationships in the text, whether that's Felix and Safi, or Victor and Elizabeth. So he doesn't talk about that, right? It doesn't talk about it being like the need for erotic love so much as it's just some kind of intersocial bond, right? That is sincere, right? That is reciprocated. So yeah, that's another
I'm glad that you brought this up, because it's something of a conundrum that I think of. If you start from the beginning at the scene that you painted with the guy on the ship, basically desiring a companion. He's writing in his letters to his sister that he desires a companion, and throughout the book, as you say, the creature desires just someone who will love him as he is, just the way the blind man loved him, without kind of regard of his for his looks. So he was not frightened by the creature's looks. So it becomes really weird that he in the end asks for a mate, in a sense, for a female companion. And something I tend to ask my students is, how does he know that he's heterosexual?
Right, exactly.
Because obviously he's observed different couples, and he's deriving from that. Okay, well, maybe I need to have a female because that's the norm. But that's, as you say, there is a kind of an absence of the eros, of the erotic, of the sexual desire. And for me, this is why that kind of ending is really interesting, because when he asks for this companion, there are two things. One, he wants someone who will be like him. So a creature that is of his species. So that's one thing. He understands that he cannot be loved by a different species. Rather, it has to be someone like him. That's one thing. The other thing for me is really interesting, and that's that Victor's reaction, if I remember it correctly, is he imagines monster sex and monster babies.
Right, exactly.
So he's like, this is horrible. What is this future going to be like if there are all these monster babies and I cannot conceive of the monsters having sex?
Right, exactly. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So that's he's disgusted by the very idea of two creatures having sex and having these babies. He could just as well create this female without a womb and so. But no, he destroys her just on the off chance that she might bear children.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. My students bring this up all the time because they're always like, come on, he's a scientist. He knows how this works. This is not an inevitability. And I don't recall. I mean, it would be a strike against his case. So he probably rhetorically would not bring up the chance of offspring, but the creature never mentions that as his desire, right? It's not like he wants a population. He just wants one person, right? But I have another theory. So I would agree. I think there's it's his models again. What books does he read, right? Although, sorry, a thing that comes to mind. I always tell my students about the opening book of Paradise Lost, because a big part of Paradise Lost both tells the story of Adam and Eve, but it tells the story of Lucifer, of Satan's fall. And there's that amazing moment where Satan wakes up in pandemonium with all the other fallen angels, and he sees their appearance and says, how must I look now that I see you who were so beautiful, the sort of like creature of like light and glory, like being so ugly and hideous and horrific now, right? Like I can only imagine how bad I look. But the creature points out that Satan was better off than he was, because even when Satan was exiled, he had companions, right? And these are not eroticized companions, right? These are just sort of like friendships. These are it's like a troop of compatriots, right? So he does have models for like non-heterosexual companions, but most of his models are heterosexual companions, right? Adam and Eve, Felix, the family. There's a lot of discussion of family. But one twist I would bring to the narrative too. Many commentators point out that there's a lot of parallels between Victor and the creature, right? These sort of inversions, these doublings, these mirrorings. And I do follow the French philosopher René Girard when he talks about the notion of mimetic desire, which is to say that we desire what other people desire. So there's this kind of doubling effect. And so the fact that, the creature asks Victor for a female companion, and the fact that Victor creates that companion after he's been engaged to Elizabeth, right? It's as almost if the creature is seeing Victor's happiness and wants it for himself, not because of a kind of overwhelming primary urge, but almost like a secondary urge, right? He wants some kind of, it's like he's modeling himself after what Victor has in some kind of way. And so I think, and that of course is then why he can invert it and recognizes that the best revenge for not getting the companion he wants would be to kill Elizabeth, not to kill Victor himself, right? So I think it's a whole psychodrama in so many ways, you know?
I absolutely agree. It's absolutely amazing. There is this. This is why I mentioned this: learning from watching, learning from observing, learning from reading. Where do we get this sense of how love and companionship and all these things actually work? Where do they come from, and how do we know what's right, what's wrong, and how do we know that it's right to love in this way and not in that way? And I love this doubling of desire, as you say. He learns to desire. So desire, it was almost like not natural, but rather we learn that to imitate it. Yeah. So I think earlier when we spoke about just generally about the desire and so on, and not in this podcast, but when you and I conversed, you mentioned this scene in I forget which movie it is, where there is a woman watching a train passing by with all these scenes taking place in different windows in different carriages.
Exactly. Yeah. It's and I know about it because Slavoj Žižek has a documentary where he comments on that film as kind of a meta-cinematic moment where he says, we go to the movies to learn how to desire things, right? And I think I used to always joke when I was younger, right? Yeah, we learned how to kiss by watching TV, right? You see people kiss on TV, and that's how you do it, right? No one teaches you this, but art teaches you this, right? So, which speaks to why, there's been this long history of people being anxious about desire in art, right? And, what I think is really fun and illuminating about reading Frankenstein as a love story, as you've proposed, is exactly on this question of reading, because I personally see reading as being both a joy and a danger, or to use another French philosopher, it's like a pharmakon, right? Which is the Greek word that is both poison and cure. And so on the one hand, reading is so important to Walton. He talks about reading his uncle's books, to Victor, to the creature. But at the same time, reading alone is dangerous, right? Reading without the kind of testing of other people can send you down these somewhat deadly or problematic paths, right? So there's this interesting sense in which, the book is also about education. It's about how do we educate ourselves? How do we learn things, not just intellectually, but emotionally and erotically and relationally. And so be careful what you read, right? That's part of the, I do think that's part of the what this book is about.
Yes,
which of course is interesting because I will confess, I think the first time I read Frankenstein probably was the later edition where she revised it really heavily. And in most of our teaching and scholarship now, people teach and read the 1818 edition because it's a lot more, it's a lot less apologetic for Victor's kind of challenging of nature, whereas the later the revision, there's kind of a backlash to the character, and she sort of tones down Victor's final reflections and sort of makes Victor feel more repentance and basically say we shouldn't mess with nature, we shouldn't take the role of God. So she herself kind of saw, and she grew up in a family where there was a celebration of dangerous books, right? Her parents were intellectuals and kind of political radicals. Mary Wollstonecraft was really one of the first robust feminist writers to like publish an entire treaty on the rights of women. So, you know, I think she was aware of this kind of pharmacological dimension to books.
Oh, most certainly, and in a sense, it's a really great note to kind of wrap up our discussion, because we bring us back to the question of, as you say, art, because we are in the period of Romanticism, and they very much paid attention to what art does. And as you said, education and dangerous books and art is, in a sense, dangerous. At the same time, it's also good.
Yeah, absolutely.
So this is why I also prefer that earlier raw manuscript, because the more you polish it, in a sense, the more you're trying to kind of remove these rough edges. In a sense, it's like an intellectual intervention, and you're trying with your more experienced eyes to come back to your work. This is something all of us authors, the writers know this, that if you go back to your earlier work, you maybe want to edit something out and you want to revise it. But a lot of times that would kill that raw energy which constituted the story, with all its problems of craft, of plotting, of characterization and all these things. And this is why I love this book. In a sense, as you say, maybe this is why we are teaching it, so we don't spend too much time alone with it.
Right. Yeah.
We don't want to be alone with this book, or any book, as you say. Spending too much time with it will drive you crazy. You mentioned Victor's love for the books on alchemy and so on. So I think this is really a beautiful kind of connection back to how the book draws attention to itself as form, as art, as human creation, because there is a kind of a parallel between the creature and the creation of the book that is the monster that Shelley created, in a sense.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's a monster that still haunts us. I mean, so many, centuries later, we are still teaching this book. We are still reading it. It still haunts us. We haven't left it.
Absolutely. And I think on that note, I mean, two things I'll say as also kind of a wrap up gesture is that the haunting, I think, is equally special, or like what compels me about the particular haunting of this book is that kind of raw. I mean, it certainly was edited, but there is this kind of uncraftedness to it, because so often our conventional stories about books that last, about classics, is their kind of like mastery, right? Like they're masterpieces. And I think that this is not a formal masterpiece, but it's an imaginative work of genius, right?
Yes.
And that's what allows it to continually kind of speak to us, because it's been the reason. I mean, even though there's all these misconceptions in popular culture because it's been translated and repurposed so many times, I think it's precisely because of that imaginative genius that sort of underpins it. And I'm not denying Shelley's capacity for craft. It's just that that's not really what is what pulls us back to the book, right? It's this, it's all of the energy that it sort of is engaging with, and all of the ideas aesthetically, intellectually, that are not just of its time, but are sort of, I think, are like the ideas of modernity, right? I mean, in so many ways, that as long as we're dealing with that kind of the human as the technological being, as you mentioned, this book is going to be something that speaks to us. And then the second thing I was thinking of is that, this conversation is a great example of at least the pleasure of talking about the books, because this is how we, in so many respects, what we're doing is exactly what Walt and Victor and the creature probably needed or wanted, but couldn't always have. And the results are not are not as robust and as life-giving as they could be, which is why I think it is important that we continue to teach and discuss and have these kinds of conversations about books.
Yes, I absolutely agree. And this was such an amazing pleasure, Paul. Thank you so much. I mean, from the way this was going, I think we could have spoken for another hour or 2 hours or 10 hours. We could have gone on into the night. And you can see, here in Stockholm, the October darkness is settling in. It's coming, and it's only 3:30 right now, but the darkness is coming really soon. So I think we could have almost gotten into this mood of speaking the darkness, maybe around the fire, maybe if we had some kind of image of a fire between us in this podcast, that would have been kind of like a special effect. But I kind of wanted to feel it during the day so that we have a little bit of light, maybe a little bit of the autumnal leaves behind me and so on. So,
well, it's the same here. Here in Michigan, last night was the first snow warning of the season. We didn't actually have snow, but it's cold and gray here. So yes, autumn is definitely coming, which is a good time to revisit this book.
It's a very good time. It's a very good mood for this book to be revisited. Paul, thank you so much again. And I hope down the line we can come back and talk more about other books, other stories, more about love. I don't think we have exhausted this subject or all the books that we love.
Definitely not. Thank you so much, Adnan, for this invitation. It was equally a pleasure for me.
Thank you.